Good morning, everybody. It's day 2 in Paris. It's day 4 in terms of seminars. We heard from Jack Caputo last week. Whatever day I arrived here, Thursday, it was a walking tour around Paris. Yesterday, you and I were in here. And today we're sort of wrapping up our portion of this. And yesterday, we talked more probably about theoretical conceptual ideas around radical theology and intersections with psychoanalysis and philosophy, and why we're even interested in the sort of theological aspects of life. Today we're going to try and talk more about practice. And because I think regardless of whatever discipline you find yourself fascinated by in life, whether it's psychoanalysis or philosophy or whatever, I think it's really important that you have to kind of integrate your life into what it is that you hold precious and hold dear. And I think with the sort of conversation that we've been having about radical theology, that the communal aspect of it is kind of an increasingly important component. So that's what we're going to try and talk about today, amongst other things. But yesterday you started with a story about your friend Seamus, who I've yet to meet, and I've known you for so many years.
You've heard many stories about Seamus over the years. Gets himself in all sorts of trouble.
I think it's like that James Stewart movie where he had the invisible bunny rabbit friend. I think that's who Seamus is. But anyway, you have a story today.
I do. That was a good setup. That was very subtle.
It was, wasn't it?
I don't think
it was almost like we hadn't talked about.
That's right. Yes, I always have a story. I always have a story.
Good.
I'd love to start the story. And I was thinking actually this morning, the story I told yesterday, you could see that as the story of Job. I mean, it could be like the summation of like God's having a bet with the devil, and Job's friends are all trying to think if there's a reason for this. There's some cosmic theodicy that makes sense of all of this craziness. And then Job kind of at the end encounters God. He's just going like, hey, I'm just doing what I want to do. Who are you to kind of question me? So there's something about that story that is orthodox. That's my way of saying it, is, because it's in the Bible. It's in the book of Job. It must be right
in the book of Seamus.
It's in the book of Seamus. I actually do want to write a book about Seamus someday. So I'll start with another story, kind of similar thing. This is just about 3 people who all die on the same day. This mystic, this evangelical pastor, and this fundamentalist preacher from Northern Ireland called Seamus, right? So they all die and they all go to heaven. And as we know, you have to get an interview with Jesus before you get in, right? So they're all sitting in the waiting room, and St. Peter comes out and he looks at the mystic first and he says, okay, you first. And he leads the mystic into this little interview room. The doors closed, the signs turned around, interview in progress. And the mystic is in there for about, 45 minutes. And then the door opens, the mystic comes out and he's smiling to himself. And he's going, he says, I knew I was wrong. I knew I was wrong. And then just walks into heaven, just smiling to himself. Next is the evangelical pastor's turn. The evangelical pastor gets up, goes into the interview room, the little signs turned around, and he's in there for about 3 hours, and suddenly the door flies open and the evangelical preacher comes out and he says, how could I have been so wrong? Distraught, walks into heaven. And then finally it's Seamus, this fundamentalist preacher from Northern Ireland. He gets up, he goes into the interview room, the signs turned around, and he's in there for about 8 hours. And after 8 hours, the door flings open and Jesus comes out pulling his hair going, how could I have been so wrong? Right? Thank you for that. That's a story I told at the very beginning of when I started speaking about this stuff. And it's in my first book called How Not to Speak of God. And in that first book and the first time that I told that story, I interpreted it in the way that it was intended, right? So the way you're supposed to interpret that joke is the mystic is the one who's right, okay, right? The mystic goes into the interview room, realizes epistemological humility, before the absolutes, I'm always wrong, embraces that unknowing, embraces that humility, embraces a type of theopoetics, and then goes into heaven. And the joke is against the fundamentalist, right? The fundamentalist is so secure, won't budge, and then Jesus comes out and says, well, how could I have been so wrong? I'm now using this in my, I keep calling it my last book as if I'm going to die. If I do, that would be kind of interesting. That would be a good time to die because it's at the very end of this last book. And I tell it again, but now I'm on the side of the fundamentalist. And we're going like, oh, it's the fundamentalist who's right. In the mystic, you have epistemological unknowing. But with the fundamentalist, you have ontological unknowing. What the fundamentalist does now, without realizing it, is so questions the absolute that the absolute realizes that they don't know what's going on. So that's the move, which I was talking about yesterday, from the unknown God to the unknowing God, or from epistemological unknowing to ontological unknowing, where the unknowing is at the very heart of being itself. This is the work of the Church of the Contradiction. The Church of the Contradiction is not about epistemological unknowing, which I kind of started with myself. It's not about saying that we have doubts. We don't know things. I mean, that's an obvious truism. I mean, you just open up YouTube and your page that you open up will have lots of videos about stuff you don't know. There's lots of things we don't know. There's lots of things that we don't know, but what's that?
Sorry,
Oh,
Brazilian bikini wax.
exactly. Yes.
Speak for yourself.
I have watched the most weird videos, yes, about stuff and learned, that I didn't even know that I didn't know. And that's a wonderful thing about the world we live in with this technology. And then there's stuff that in principle we can know. There might be super intelligent civilizations that know things obviously that we don't. So that's obvious epistemological unknowing or epistemological humility. But and Kierkegaard talks about this. It's almost like we don't have the blueprint of life. God has the blueprint, but we don't. And we have to live with the fact that we don't have the blueprint. We see through a glass darkly. But the move from epistemological unknowing to ontological unknowing is to see the doubt, the complexity, and the unknowing as fundamental to reality itself. Right? There's no going past it. Like that's almost like the ultimate insight. And that's what Hegel's phenomenology of spirit can be read as. It's the movement where we're trying to overcome contradiction. We're trying to overcome our unknowing. And yet the contradiction simply deepens. And at every level, it deepens more and more and more until you realize that contradiction is at the heart of everything. And you could almost say that at every major moments of transformation in the universe, it's a deepening of contradiction from nothing to being, from being to life, from life to consciousness, from consciousness to self-consciousness. All of these, the contradiction kind of deepens. So in a nutshell, you could say that, this cup has quantum contradiction going on in it. A dog has not only as a body quantum contradiction going on within it, also as a conscious form of life, it has an evolutionary contradiction, biological contradiction, what we call evolution at a biological level. And then we go up to being human. We have at subjectivity in our bodies, contradictions going on in our conscious life, in our just life, contradictions going on at biological level, and at a subjective level, contradiction is happening, which we can call sexuation or gender or whatever. So we're kind of like the contradiction is deepening and deepening. And in Church of Contradiction, it's kind of an attempt to draw people into that experience. So I'll say one more thing, hand over to Barry, we'll just keep talking. But yesterday I talked about theism as God exists, atheism in its standard form, God does not exist, radical theology, God is the inexistent thing. God is the name for a type of nothingness that persists and that insists. Today, I want to unpack the idea of so theism is God exists, atheism, God does not exist, radical theology, God realizes that God does not exist. Right. Again, that's the move in a nutshell. That and one of Shizak's most famous jokes, which I won't retell, I'm sure most of you know it, but the one about the seed, the man who thinks he's seed goes to a psychoanalyst. In a nutshell, he's cured, realizes he's not seed, we realize he's a human being, and then a few weeks later comes back to the psychoanalyst, and the analyst says, you're looking very stressed. What's wrong? And the guy says, oh, my next door neighbor's got a pile of chickens, and I'm terrified they're going to eat me. They're like, what do you mean? You're not seed on the ground. The guy laughs. Says, of course I know I'm not seed, but do the chickens know? Right? So it's brilliant, absolutely brilliant summation of a psychoanalytic notion. And in the same way, you can know that God does not exist, but does God know? Right? That's the interesting thing. And in other words, does something have to happen out there where, in a sense, God experiences God's own self-contradiction? And that's the most challenging thing. That it's not that you believe or you don't believe, it's that you have a liturgical structure that undergoes the death of God, undergoes crucifixion. And somehow, if you participate in that liturgical structure, what you're encountering is God realizing that God does not exist. So that's the central notion to what this idea is of Church of the Contradiction, or the Profane Temple, which is the name of an article. I took this term from Barry Taylor, which I always forget. I always steal terms and forget, but I'm sure you came up with Profane Temple. And it's an article that we will potentially hand out to everybody at some point. It's a rough draft, so either we give out the rough draft or we wait till it's all cleaned up.
Yeah, either way.
Either way, okay.
But
so
we'll give it to you, and then you can send it out. Yeah. Yeah, and we can talk about this because I think it kind of encapsulates where you've come to in the trajectory of your engagement with radical theology. And I think we covered yesterday all of the, well, maybe actually the one question that interests me is what was it about psychoanalytic theory that fascinated you enough to want to think about the relationship between psychoanalytic notions, ideas, and the religious component of life and theology?
Yeah.
I don't know that we talked about that specifically, but I think that's always an interesting thing, like how we link things together. And that's a little bit of a tangent, but maybe that's a way into thinking about this stuff and why why even bother? Because that's always the question, isn't it? Why bother?
Yes. And it's an interesting thing to be doing this alongside Fink and Lacanian psychoanalytic seminar, because
I was making some links with what Bruce was saying with what you were talking about yesterday morning. So really interesting.
Yeah, because I'm very obviously influenced by Fink and by Lacan and by Zizek and Todd McGowan, these pieces, and like a Sapancic. So there's a sense in which I found the conceptual tools for what I wanted to do in the psychoanalytic literature. So yesterday I mentioned like how I personally came across it is a series of accidents, right? So, which are interesting or not, but if I put out those series of accidents into a theoretical frame, yesterday I did a very brief genealogy of the death of God. Started with Paul to Luther, to Hegel, to Nietzsche, to Freud, to Lacan. And the reason why I kind of drew out that genealogy is to say that for me, the technology of the death of God. So whenever Nietzsche says, God is dead, the famous God is dead parable, and the interesting thing is he's not talking to people who believe in God. In the parable, he's talking to people who don't believe in God. He's talking to people who are the enlightened people. And then this madman says, God is dead and you have killed him, and his blood is on your hands, and goes on to describe this. What's interesting about that is Nietzsche's not saying you religious people or you people who believe in God, you have to encounter the death of God. He's saying that the kind of enlightened secular world hasn't encountered the death of God. And that's the fascinating thing. And so that idea really struck me, because for me, the secular world is profoundly religious, profoundly ideological. I went to LA because it's the mecca of religion. Every corner, someone's promising wholeness and completeness, commodity satisfaction, sexual liberation, psychedelic enlightenment, all of these fame, like these promises of wholeness and completeness, that the church doesn't like hold a candle to that shit anymore, right? It's like, if you want the religious message of wholeness and completeness, even of living forever, is kind of more found in the tech world, where potentially death will be overcome in a variety of ways, through technology, through uploading our consciousness, through augmenting our bodies, or some stoic idea that, that, oh, well, don't worry about death, because when death arrives, you're not around to have it. So when you're alive, death isn't there. When you're dead, you're not around. Yeah. So those are the two good news. One is basically, it's like, you don't have to encounter death. You don't have to encounter death by biohacking and hoping in technology will get us somewhere. Or don't worry about death because, we never meet death. No, no, no. The good news is you're already dead. You just don't know it, right? That's the good news of Christianity, from a radical Christianity, is that there's a fundamental sense in which we are, in the words of Julie Reich, the constellation of death. Life is the constellation of death. Castration, there is a fundamental loss. It's not that the move to being human is a fundamental gain. In a sense, something drops out. There's a fundamental loss, a signifier drops out, however you want to say it. But castration is that the passage into life is through a fundamental giving up of a fundamental jouissance or whatever. So like, and I'm sorry, I'm kind of going on a tangent, but this will make sense. You're happy enough.
Yeah.
Is they, on a very simple level, you can think about a relationship. You can be in a relationship with somebody and it's already dead, but the two people just don't know it, right? And the death manifests itself in symptoms. Yes, yes, nice. I'll use that line. Yes, very good. Yes, and two people 20 years can go past, and it's manifesting in the health of the children, in affairs, or in alcohol abuse, or workaholism, or it's manifesting, but the two people don't know that the relationship's dead, right? Now, what they might eventually do is go to a therapist. And it's not so much to try to figure out the relationship. They go to the analyst or the therapist, and in a way, what they're doing is symbolizing the death that's already taken place. That's what they're doing. They're almost going like, they have to put words to the death. They have to realize that this is already dead. They just didn't know it. When you do that, one of two things can happen. You can either stay together, break up with the type of relationship you had, or break up entirely and move different directions, but things cannot stay the same. You start to symbolize the death, and a transformation happens. And if that doesn't happen, what occurs is you can split up with the person, but not with the type of relationship you have. So you enter into repetition, and you have the same type of relationship with the next person, and the next person, and the next person. So that's one way. Then, in a more fundamental way, you can think about what Winnicott calls primal agony, which is what a lot of people suffer from. I know people who suffer from this, is late at night, they're overcome with absolute terror of some loss that's going to happen. Their partner's going to leave them. They're going to lose their job. The world is going to collapse through climate change, or the economy is going to collapse, right? Some of these are very reasonable positions that someone might have, but it's primal agony. It's overwhelming. It's terrifying. Now, for Winnicott, again, the idea is that, well, the good news here is the catastrophe isn't coming. It's already happened. This is an echo of some fundamental loss that you experienced as an infant, but have not been able to symbolize. So what you're terrified is going to happen is, in a way, what has already happened, but you haven't been able to tarry with it. So in primal agony, you begin to look at that fundamental loss, like you were sent off to boarding school, and it separated you from your parents in a traumatic kind of way, whatever it is. And you start to talk about the boarding school experience and that loss, and then suddenly the primal agony starts to dissipate. You still might be scared of those things, but it's not primal agony. And then at a more fundamental level, which is the Lacanian level, it's actually, because that's still in your history, but this idea of original sin, originary lack, is that to be a subject at all is to undergo a fundamental experience of lack, of death. And again, what's important is to somehow symbolize that, to put symbols to it, to tarry with it. This again is why liturgy is important. Again, this, and I want to, and Barry has run these liturgical experiences with two things: the Secret Philosophical Society in LA, yeah, and soon hopefully we're going to do a version of Belfast, and then also Sunday service, which is more significant for this kind of thing. People go like, well, why are you doing liturgy? What's the point of this? So like, it's to symbolize the death that you already are. To encounter this lack in some way through music, through poetry, through art, to gather as a communion around this shared loss. I think that's a fundamentally important thing. It's not just if you've got a particular trauma, you go to a psychoanalyst, but there's the traumas that happen to you, but there is the trauma that is you, right? And the trauma that is you is something that I think we need a space where we can, let's ultimately say, find a way to enjoy that trauma, to rob it of its suffering. Not entirely, but to allow that suffering to somehow be productive, right? That's part of what we're doing. Psychoanalysis is the tools or the conceptual framework that allowed me to begin to conceptualize those kinds of notions.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's quite, I was thinking this morning, because it's easy to forget that in this city where so many people did profound and continue to do profound things, particularly in the philosophical and stuff, that we're in Lacan's hometown.
Yeah.
And we're in a place where he established the école, a school, but really a community. And I think it was Michel de Certeau, who was one of the founders of the École Freudienne with Lacan, said very much that the reason it was called an école rather than a society or a college or an institute was precisely because of a religious bent in Lacan's thinking. His brother was a Benedictine. He grew up in a family of religious people. And there are lots of people who look at many of even nom de père, which is one of the names for an abbot, not just the father, but a nom de père is the abbot of a monastery. You know what I mean? Yeah. So but what I was going to say was, what I think is interesting about the practice of radical theology, the recitation, the liturgical aspect of that, is that in some ways for me it performs a dual function, and it has to do with my particular take on how I think the notion of the religious shifts and changes historically in terms of people's sort of awareness and self-understanding. So this comes because all of this comes after that trajectory that you spoke of yesterday, the death of God, Luther, Hegel, blah, 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 down all the way. But for me, the liturgical thing revolves around two things, or has revolved around two things. The one thing is confronting this thing, the secular unawareness that they haven't come to terms with the death of God, which I think is a key element of the Christian story. It begins and ends there. The other is that I think it's also about attention to desire. But death and desire, for me, were the two components of or are the two components of a kind of radical theological liturgical practice. So there's the one thing where you are coming to terms with lack and loss, the things that we don't even, and learning to it. I mean, it's a strange thing to say, to enjoy the lack, but it's really the truth of the matter is to come to terms with that.
And because what everybody wants to do is turn lack into loss. This is what Todd McGowan is very good. So loss is contingent, it's historical. There's something you lost, a previous utopia, a previous paradise, you get it back. And so most ideology wants to reduce lack, which is fundamental to loss that can be overcome, which then is a scapegoat mechanism. Whereas what you're saying is that whenever you embrace lack, you're saying there is no before. And then in one sense, how does one live with and even enjoy this fundamental wound within reality?
Yeah. And then the other aspect is that, at least in my read of Christian theology, to go all the way back to the book of Genesis, is the birth of desire out of the fall. Yeah. So you have within the horizon of Christian theology, I think, two key locations that directly connect both with Lacanian notions of lack, but also with desire as a central component of the theological enterprise and exercise.
Can I say something about that, actually? Because this is interesting, and I haven't done this before, but actually, in psychoanalysis, let's make a distinction between demand, desire, and drive very quickly. And I think I can relate this to three types of religion. So demand, in a nutshell, is what you see in an infant, right? A demand is you're hungry, you make a cry, you get fed, right? So it's very basic, one-to-one. You want something and you get something, right? And the perverse subject experiences the other as a demand that I can fulfill completely, right? So as the fantasy of the perverse subject is that the other is making a demand, I can fulfill that demand. But that's demand, very simple. The funny thing is, most people in a popular level just think that that's what desire is, in a way, is that you want a coffee and you buy a coffee. You want a car, you get a car, whatever, right? That's demand. Demand is for an object. Desire is for, potentially, you could say, in a nutshell, a lost object. So the idea of desire in psychoanalysis is ultimately kind of like you're barred from the mother's breast. You're barred from this private enjoyment that you kind of had pre-subject, right? And what's called the incest taboo is in anthropology, which is, you can't stay privately enjoying at your mother's breast. You have to get substitute enjoyments in the world. That's the incest taboo. This is the Oedipus complex, right? So you have to, you break away from this mother-child symbiosis. And every object is a poor replacement for that kind of symbiotic oneness, right? So in one sense, you think of it, so when you desire a car, it ultimately you get it, and it's not that satisfying. When you get it, and you keep moving. So desire becomes this mimetic thing. So already in desire, you see that nothingness or lack is involved. And then drive, you can say, is for loss itself. So if demand is for an object, desire is for the lost object, drive is for loss itself. Now, in terms of three forms of religion, you could say, there's types of popular religion where God is an object that you can have that satisfies you, and there's promise of going to church and you encounter God and you find satisfaction. The guy who lives beside me is as a social influencer, which we're starting to get even in Northern Ireland, and he just found Jesus. I knew it was going to happen. I could tell. I could tell, because
getting baptized.
Oh, well, no, but he's proper big influencer. I could use his as an example. That's fascinating. I've been watching that. Yeah, I know, it's crazy. This is this young guy who he was really into it. There's a movie came out a couple of years ago about the Jesus people. I can't remember what it was called. The Jesus Freaks, 1960s, American, whatever. Yeah. He watched it, and on his Instagram, he was like, he really liked it. And I could tell he was having all these parties, and he was a young guy in his 20s making money, but he was dissatisfied. Anyway, but he found Jesus, and at the moment he's in the God has satisfied me completely. So there's God as demand. God as desire, I think, is more kind of the more mature high church that says, well, no, until the next life. We don't know God fully, you know, God is incomplete. There's a certain kind of discontent that's part of life. We see through a glass darkly, then we will see, we'll get to heaven, and you know, maybe everything will be great there. So there's a kind of God as the lost object. What we're talking about with radical theology is God has lost itself, right? So we're talking about a religion not of demand, a religion not of desire, but we're talking about a religion of drive, which I don't think there's an institutional form of that. That's why I do this work. I don't think there is an institutional form of God as drive. And I can't, yeah, I just wanted to throw that in. I don't know what we,
okay. The word liturgy means the work of the people.
Yeah.
So it's really interesting how you bring liturgy in, or it is, you're framing this, is a kind of a work of the people in the drive or something.
Yes. And and here's the thing, I'll tell you, here's my interpretation of Nietzsche's parable of the death of God using another parable. And this is a story about Paddy Englishman, Paddy Irishman, Paddy Scotsman. I don't know if you get those jokes anywhere else in the world. So where does Paddy come from? There are these jokes that we have in Ireland and England that always have a Paddy Englishman, Paddy Irishman, Paddy Scotsman. But where does the Paddy come from? That's an Irish word.
It's an Irish word, and it used to be. I mean, they used to mean Irish people were paddies. I think it's from the First World War for some reason, but I'm not sure why.
Yeah.
Oh, maybe.
Okay. So maybe they all live in Ireland. Well, funnily enough, they all do live in Ireland, these guys. English guy, Irish guys.
Amazing.
Yeah. The funny thing about this, which I like, is about these jokes, the structure of them is the Irish guy is always the butt of the joke. So these are jokes that we tell in Ireland about the English, the Irish, and the Scottish. And we're always the butt of our joke, which I love. And I do actually think that right-wing enjoyment, I think, is always enjoyment of someone else being a dick. Left-wing enjoyment should be that you enjoy yourself being a dick. You know, there's a certain sense in which the joke is on you. So anyway, but Paddy Englishman, Paddy Irishman, Paddy Scotsman. But they're all in a competition, and the competition is who can build the biggest sheep pen. And this is actually the kind of, but you know what? We had a show on TV in England and Ireland, which was called One Man and His Dog.
Oh my God, yes.
This was prime time TV, where one guy, a farmer and a sheepdog, would round up sheep by whistling, right? And the sheepdog, and they would put the sheep into a sheep pen. This was prime time fucking TV.
Competition.
Right? Competition. One man and his dog. So this
for years.
For years. That's what we watched on Saturday night at 7 o'clock. Well, it probably is. Actually,
it is better.
Yeah,
I better than American Idol.
Yeah,
You try to see if you can get as much sheep in
as quickly as possible. Yeah, that's the competition.
Yeah.
One man and his dog. Yeah, absolutely brilliant.
That was very good.
Yeah. So based probably off that, this joke started to circulate that they had to build a sheep pen. Who could hold the most sheep? So the English guy goes first and builds a sheep pen, can fit like 50 sheep. Then it's the Scottish guy, builds a sheep pen, can fit 75 sheep. Well, this Irish guy, Seamus, he's just sitting getting an Irish suntan, right, going red. And he's not doing any work. And about half an hour before the end of the competition, he then suddenly gets up with all this stuff, and he puts one piece of wood in front of him, one piece of wood behind him, one piece of wood on either side of him, just, you know, knocks him into place, and he starts painting furiously. And the judges come up, and the judges are laughing at Seamus. They're looking at this tiny box, and they're saying, Seamus, that's ridiculous. He says, you couldn't get one sheep in that sheep pen. And Seamus just looks at them and says, what do you mean? He says, I'm not in the sheep pen. He says, I'm outside of it. You're the ones you're standing in it, right? That's the Nietzschean death of God, right? Is that the secular people are laughing at the profane temple, going, you're in ideology. This is the place where you're in the wholeness, the completeness, you're in the, and then the response is, no, you're the ones who are standing in that. All this fucking like taking psilocybin and polyamory and all. Not that I'm against any of these things, but if you think they're the answer, you're ridiculous. You're just caught up in religious bullshit. You step out of ideology into a desert in the oasis in which you kind of see that none of these things work. There is no sexual relation. There is no answer. That is the salvatory move. And that's why it's, again, the liturgy is vitally important.
Yeah. So should we talk about that then?
Oh, yes. Yes. Oh, yeah, and what it looks like. And yeah.
Yeah. So Well, we can talk about the things that we do and have done, and then maybe we can sort of unpack what was in what they were for.
Yes.
So when I lived in Los Angeles for a long time, and I ran two very different kind of communal experiences. One was called Sunday service, and it was in a church on Sunday morning at 10 o'clock, well, 11, but sort of church time, with music and a talk and a ritual. So from the outside, just church, except that the music wasn't religious, the talk wasn't strictly orthodoxly theological, and the ritual was Eucharistic, but in a materialist Christian way. And the goal was really to confront two things, the two things that we discussed really, the lack that religion probably in the 20th century was one of the biggest deniers of, because of the salvific aspect of a lot of contemporary religion and all of the promise that so you don't have to worry about where you go when you die. So it's fascination with the afterlife. So the extension of life beyond death. So you don't have to think about death. You can be happy because when you die, you're going to go to heaven. So much of the discourse is post-life. So life in some ways is life is dismissed. Material life is essentially in the way. So a lot of the emphasis is on the inner life, so-called, the separation, very binary and stuff like that. So this was an attempt to essentially incarnate a kind of materiality to existence and address, if you like, two things. One, the universal lack at the heart of all of humanity, the lack that just is at the core of what it means to be human. But secondly, then perhaps you could say the context-specific lack of our lives, because I think there's the lack that we all have and we all experience, and then there are the experiences of lack that manifest in our own cultural, social, specific life contexts. And in many ways, a lot of contemporary religion, spirituality, particularly wellness, seeks to address both those things, but it addresses them with the promise of overcoming or achievement or optimism or accomplishment or whatever else it is. So the practice in that was just simply to invert all of those things and just to reverse that and go, no, this is what we have to not just come to terms with, but learn to see as part of the nature of what it is to be human. And a bit like, Camus, when you come to terms with the meaninglessness of all existence, you can find actually joyful meaning in life. The strange dilemma where the striving to understand it all actually generates the very anxiety that you're trying to overcome all the time. So if you just put the brakes on and you're just going, no, wait a minute, let's switch direction, let's switch focus, let's look somewhere else. You suddenly discover, oh, there's actually a joy in living. There's a celebration of life. The other thing, that's enough, And the other thing I did was a thing called the Secret Philosophical Society, and I kind of set that up as a secret cult. wasn't that secret, but it was just this idea because
You
again,
also had the tea cult. But
yeah,
anyway,
I have an ongoing tea cult, which is an online community. Where actually nobody drinks tea, but it just seemed like it. I started during the pandemic tea time in England, so you know, have a cup of tea. But anyway, but I started this thing called the Secret Philosophical Society because I spent 30 years in Los Angeles, and one of the things that I always found incredibly fascinating, and I made part of the fabric of my life there, was the incredible expanse of philosophical, esoteric, and spiritual almost madness in, I mean, it's one of the most spiritually centered places in the world on some level. And the roots of California, I mean, there's a very interesting book called The Visionary State by a writer named Eric Davis, which kind of charts the way in which California, and particularly the very fabric of the city of Los Angeles, is built on esoteric, spiritual and numerological ideas, because it was a seedbed in the 20s and 30s for kind of refugees and expats from Europe who brought to Los Angeles all of their strange ideas. And many of the buildings around Los Angeles, famous ones, were actually built according to weird geometries and numerologies and all. So the fabric of the city is, it's no surprise to me that so much from California sort of comes out of there, because it's sort of built that way. So there, I went to lots of kind of weird, culty, religious things just to check it all out. So I thought, oh, well, maybe we should start like a secret society, you know. So we had a if you came, and this was an event-based thing. So we did it in an art gallery, and it was open to the public, so it was more porous. And the basic idea was that it was a philosophical cabaret where we would rehearse a particular theme, a big theme. So we picked specifically grand themes with the intention of making it so big that you sort of couldn't get a definitive answer. But we built it around this idea of a secret society, kind of like the Masons or something like that. So when you joined, you signed your name in an old leather book with a red glass pen in red ink that kind of looked like your blood, and then you took absinthe and had a shot of absinthe, and then you were in the cult. And then the experience was that there would be a theme. So death. I think the first event we did was called "Wake Up and Smell the Coffin," and it was an exploration of death. And the idea was you'd get 2 or 3 people with different roles in the world of death. So we had this woman who wrote a book. She worked in a mortuary. She was kind of this goth woman who got a job working in a mortuary, and she wound up becoming really fascinated by people dying and stuff like that. And so now she's like a professional mortician. So we got, you know, I think you were that one maybe, or one of them. But, and you know, somebody talking about philosophy of death or theology of death and stuff like that. And then there'd be a ritual or a discussion. I was telling somebody, we did one on sex, and we actually did it around the idea of fetish. So we had a friend of ours who used to be a gay porn star. He was one of the speakers. We had a burlesque dancer. And there was always a ritual that involved people responding to stuff. And so the ritual for sex was we invited everybody to anonymously write down their one sexual fetish. And then and there's probably 100 people. We collected all of them and then read them out loud.
You should have like been very funny to get everybody to not write. And then if someone comes in late, then you say, everyone write Only one person writes.
That's for the next one.
That's for the next
Yeah,
one.
that's for the next
Yeah,
one.
that'd be very
But
cool.
anyway, so and the an environment that was structured, liturgical in that sense, and the goal was for us to come to terms with both the lack at the core of who we are, but also to think differently about our perversities or whatever they are, to sort of look at things from a more philosophical, maybe even psychoanalytic perspective, but also I think a deeply, for me, theological perspective. That because religion so often promises this kind of immediate kind of psychic transformation. You do this and you're going to be completely different. And they've always got some Bible verse to sort of back up their position. But the fact of the matter is, there's much of us that doesn't really change that much, which is where I think for a lot of people, disappointment sets in. I mean, on a tangent, I think it's not so surprising that at the moment, a lot of people are bouncing back towards kind of ordered forms of Christianity, you know, because the promise of all the wellness, I mean, I think they're in for a rude shock, because I don't think it's really any different. But oh, and what I was going to say is, both of those communities began as I said when I did that walking thing around Paris the other day. I said that the philosopher Simon Critchley said that all philosophy begins in disappointment, and I think in some ways theology also begins in disappointment. And what I mean by that is you sort of come to the end. And to Pete's point, you know, the sheep pen, the people outside the sheep pen are the people who don't know where they are. They can't position themselves. They're the ones in the ideology. They think they know what's going on, and they don't know what's going on. In the sheep pen, hopefully you've stepped into a world where you're coming to terms with what around you doesn't give you the answer. Anyway, I might have waffled on too much there.
Oh no, that's great. I want to pick up on a couple of things you said. One is you talked about what was it? Oh yes, the return to trad, the trad revival, right? You know, so I'll mention a couple of things about that, and then in relation to what we're trying to do with these ideas. You know, you've got, this is what Todd McGowan's argument in The End of Dissatisfaction is in that book. One of the arguments anyway, maybe the central one, is that one of the notions of God is God lacks the lack. God is absolute and complete. We all are lacking, right? So in feudalism or whatever, we're all in the same boat. None of us are going to be able to get out of it, really. None of us are going to be able to get a life that's going to be wonderful. You toil. We're all pretty much in the same boat. We all die. That's kind of the Freudian primal father, where the primal father has access to all of the women and everything he wants, and everybody else is subject to the law. And eventually they kill the primal father, set up a totem. But that's where God lacks the lack, but we all lack. Now, there's a lot of social solidarity in that, because we're all kind of in the same boat together. Today, we live in the God of the demand we enjoy. Right? Again, it's very key insight in Lacan, which is the superegoic injunction is not, you're not seeing your mum enough, you're not being nice to your neighbor, it's you're not having enough sex, you're not going out enough, you're not having enough fun, right? So the superegoic injunction is enjoy. You're guilty for not enjoying enough. FOMO, as the kids call it, right? And that idea is no one's lacking. Well, except for you, but you look around and everybody else looks like they've got the thing on Instagram or whatever. And that actually is terrible for social solidarity, because you start to get jealous of everybody else. Social fragmentation, there's no social bond because of jealousies and envies, right? So when that happens, when everything's possible, you can kind of do whatever you want. And you can just do it. Self-optimize, life hacks, seize the day, all this crap that you get online, right? It actually generates more anxiety, more social fragmentation, more loneliness, more of this sense of the superegoic conjunction, enjoy, 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 more guilt for not enjoying. That, I think, leads to the return to traditional things. So ironically, again, LA was a great lesson for me, because in a space where basically, you can do whatever you want sexually with whoever you want, people weren't doing anything, right? It became more and more isolating. Weirdly, as Lacan says, kind of referencing Sartre in his famous essay, Existentialism is Humanism, where Sartre says, if God is dead, everything is permissible, kind of misquoting kind of Dostoevsky or whatever. Lacan says, no, well, in a way, if God is dead, nothing is permissible. That weirdly, when you take out all the guardrails, you take off the sandbox, it just creates more anxiety, more social isolation, more, fears, which we're seeing. Then what do? You return to traditional models, because so in LA, you go to a conservative church like Hillsong to find a partner. You don't find a partner on Tinder and all of this stuff. You find a partner precisely by going into a conservative world again, right? Where there's all these prohibitions and therefore generate desire. In America, it's not unusual that in America they created a technology to help young people have sex, the purity ring, where you put this technology on, and by saying, I'm not going to have sex, you suddenly want to have sex, right? It generates the desire. So people who wear purity rings have more sex than people who don't have purity rings, precisely because you need the prohibition to generate the desire. So all of that to say, that's the move. That's the wrong move. What's the right move? Again, the right move, I think, is what we're trying to do with radical theology, which is not God is undivided, but we are. Not God is undivided and invites us to be undivided as well, to have everything in wholeness and completeness, but rather we're undivided and so is the absolute. Right? That's the salvatory move. The move is into a church, not like Hillsong, where you go backwards, which is kind of fascism, because that's the enjoyment of prohibition, which is the movement of where you prohibit your enjoyment. She's brilliant on this. You prohibit your enjoyment, and now suddenly you enjoy your prohibition. But rather, you enter into a space in which you realize the dividedness of everything. So a couple of things to say on that practically. There's loads of things to say on this. One, as an aside, I want to say that self-help is inherently ideology is inherently connected to self-help. They're both one and the same thing. And in self-help, it's all about going from A to B, right? I have a problem. I'm not writing a book. I don't have a relationship, whatever. I'm at A and I want to get to B. I want to get to this place, but I can't. I want to write the book, but every time I sit down, my mind goes blank. And every time I want to write, I think of something else that I should be doing, right? Now, self-help will generally go, okay, here's some tips, here's some advice, write 500 words a day, do this, go for a walk, clear your mind, whatever it is, right? Ridiculous things, because things you can find out for free if you can't work them out yourself, but you're paying someone $500 or whatever to tell you. You can pay me $500 an hour and I'll tell you those things, right? Happily take your money, but it doesn't work. Now, why does it not work? Well, because it doesn't have a concept of drive. It doesn't have a concept that you're enjoying your writer's block. It doesn't have you're enjoying not writing the book, right? So self-help is kind of going like, you want this without realizing, but there's an unconscious dimension of you that wants to not get this thing for a variety of reasons, desire and drive, right? What is the opposite of this? Again, I want to come back to a very religious term, grace, right? What is grace? Grace is the idea of not moving from A to B, right? So it's fundamentally anti-self-help, anti-ideological. It's got no, you don't move anywhere. Grace is you're accepted absolutely in your shitness, right? And Paul Tillich says it's the acceptance that you're accepted. So you can be accepted, but you don't experience it. But when you experience grace, you experience this radical acceptance that you don't have to do anything, that the frenetic pursuit, you don't have to engage in it. So grace is you don't go from A to B, you stay at A and you realize that A does not equal A. What that means is in a place of radical grace, you're able to look at, why am I not writing the book? You don't try to write it. You just look at why am I not writing it? And you realize that you have ambivalent feelings. There's things like, oh, I wanted to speak when I was young, but I also didn't feel I could because I would get told off. So I shut my mouth so as not to speak. And so, oh, I'm replaying this in this desire to write the book. I want to write it, but I also want to stay silent. This is an echo of something, right? And so suddenly you start just seeing this stuff. You start putting words to it, symbolizing it. And here's the trick. The trick is by doing that, it weakens the symptomatic dimension of, say, the mind going blank. And then you find you're able to write the book. So ironically, self-help, which is always trying to get you from A to B, is always failing because it doesn't take into consideration the enjoyment that you're getting from not writing. But in grace, where you don't have to do anything, you encounter yourself in your own divisions. You can develop a curiosity with your own unconscious and you can kind of move forward. So again, what we're talking about is how do you create communions of grace as opposed to ideological spaces of self-help. And a couple more things I want to say very quickly. This is, if to use the four discourses, Lacan's four discourses briefly, there's the discourse of the master, the university discourse, if you know, the analyst discourse, and the hysterics discourse. And I don't know if it's worth putting them up on the board or anything, but you know, you can think of the master's discourse if you know them. We're going to reference them without saying too much. Is master's discourse is a demand that is made. Beneath the demand, there's a divided subject, but the demand is made, say, the father, you have to do X. And then that's directed at somebody, and they have to interpret the demand. And that, what does that create? That creates, I just wrote them down there, desire, right? But you can think of a church of the master as you go to a church and it tells you what to do. God tells you what to do. You just do it. Now, it's like in Genesis, God says, don't eat of the fruit. By the way, Genesis is an Oedipal story, right? Perfect. Like you've got Adam and Eve walking around the garden, like before drive, before desire, right? And then there's a prohibition. You don't eat of the fruit of this tree. This tree, you will become like God. You will lack the lack, right? And then they break the prohibition. They think it's going to be wonderful and it's going to be a disaster. That's like the Freudian insight of be careful what you wish for, because if you get it, it's going to be a nightmare, right? You know, the abject horror of fulfilling your dreams. So the Oedipus story is you want to go back to the mother, the womb-like experience. The father is the prohibition. You break through the prohibition. You think it's going to be wonderful. It's a curse, right? So it's an edible plane, right? And what makes the tree magical? The prohibition, right? Before the prohibition, there isn't any desire. So the prohibition against the tree is exactly what generates the desire for what's behind the tree. You know, so, and the superegoic injunction is the serpent, right? The demand to enjoy, the demand to lack the lack, to be whole and complete, take the fruit. So we obey the superegoic injunction rather than exorcise it. So you have at the very beginning of the Jewish text an Oedipal story telling us about the nature of drive. Then, interestingly, central to the Christian story is the Temple of Jerusalem. Temple of Jerusalem has three sections. It's got the court of Gentiles. You go in, everybody's hanging out. You've got a massive curtain. Behind the curtain, you've got the Holy of Holies, where God reigns, right? So it's a replaying of the Garden of Eden. Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve walking around, a prohibition. Behind the prohibition, the fruit, right? But in Christianity, what do you get, right? Christ cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me? And at the very moment that God is realized as being self-divided, the temple curtain rips. And what do you see? You see that there's nothing behind the curtain, right? The nihilistic core of conversion, the moment that you realize that there is no absolute fulfillment. So that's the nihilistic heart of conversion, the moment when the temple curtain rips. And this is how I interpret through a glass darkly. You know this verse, very famous verse of Paul. He says, we see through a glass darkly, then we will see fully. We will know as we are known, right? Now, there's two ways of interpreting that theologically, right? One is the conservative view. One is the progressive view. The progressive view is, in this life, we see through a glass darkly. We don't see everything that in the next life, we will see clearly. We will know as we are known, right? In the conservative view, it's like, oh no, the Bible is when we see clearly. So we didn't see clearly, and the biblical text, now we see clearly. And I'm closer to the conservatives on this. But they say, Christ is the whatever, the revelation. But one Lacanian way of reading this verse is, right, you see through the glass darkly, which leads you to suspect that there's something behind the glass. Because there's a dark glass, now you're imagining something is amazing behind it. Then you shall see fully, right? Which I think is the Christian revelation, right? You see fully what? You see fully that there's nothing to see, right? That's what you see. You don't see fully that, you see fully that there's fuck all in the Holy of Holies, right? And what do you do? You shall know as you're known. Well, if you take the idea of the das Ding, that the other is ultimately an absence, at the heart of the other is this question. Then, I shall fully know as I am fully known. Well, what does it mean to know someone? It means to know someone as unknown. It means to know the dimension of das Ding in the other, not to cover over that with fantasy, to pretend, but to fully confront the das Ding of the other. I just finished producing a 4-part documentary on the life of Tammy Faye Baker. If any of you have heard of Tammy Faye Baker, if you don't, you need to look her up. Her and her husband, Jim Baker, were evangelical Christians during the 80s, the biggest evangelical Christians in the world. They had a show called PTL. They had the 3rd biggest theme park in America. It was Disney World, it was Disneyland, and then it was PTL, a Christian water park and theme rides and all that crazy stuff, right? Now, we made a documentary about her. She died very publicly of cancer and TB, but she became very beloved in America, particularly in the gay community and also in drag community, because she looked like drag, right? She was very famous for this crazy makeup, this crazy look, right? What's fascinating about her is that she was evangelical conservative Christian who became this gay icon and this drag icon who just loved everybody. You couldn't pin her down, right? And we made a documentary about her because in our world of all these divisions, I wanted somebody who just doesn't fit into any of them, neither Jew nor Gentile, slave nor free, male nor female, right? So you can have a Tammy Faye Baker, some fundamentalist Christian sitting beside some drag queen, sitting beside someone who is active in the gay culture, gay community, all together, all crying together and laughing together over Tammy Faye fucking Baker, right? Now, the thing about her is that she was pathologically unable to defend herself against the das Ding of the other. And it killed her almost, but it was beautiful. This is the injunction to love your enemy. This is the impossible injunction of Christianity. And Richard Boothby's book, I think, is brilliant on this, Embracing the Void, is that the impossible injunction to love your enemy is to open yourself to the tsunami of the das Ding of the other, to not close yourself off and make the other the same, but to be able to stand in front of the otherness of the other, to remain open to that. That's an impossible demand. Tammy Faye Baker expressed that. That's how she lived. So when people attacked her in the movie, if you've seen it, Jessica Chastain is Tammy Faye Baker. There's a scene where some kids are laughing about her and she walks up to them and she talks to them. And I knew her son and I was talking to her son about this. And I said, oh, did that happen? He said, yeah, not only did it happen, it wasn't anything like that. He said, these kids, awful kids, were in this mall and they were joking and pointing at her, at my mum. And then my mum went over to them, introduced herself and said, listen, if you're going to talk about me, you've got to get to know me first. Let me buy you lunch. She brought these bunch of kids. They went to Applebee's. She bought them all food. They all sat down and chatted and walked away. And obviously that transformed their experience, that was Tammy Faye, this openness to the otherness of the other in this demand to love, which is very Lacanian idea, to love is to accept, to basically create a harbor for the lack that is in the other. So you protect and you honor and you provide a harbor for that thing, that unknown dimension in myself, and I do that for you. That's kind of potentially what love is. By the way, that's how you connect Christology with Jesus, is that what if religion at its core dimension in Christianity is an encounter with the lack, How do you encounter the lack? Through the neighbor and through the enemy. So when I talk about God as the nothing, as the object A or whatever, right? Go like, well, how do you ultimately encounter nothingness? Through an encounter with the other. So again, the liturgy of Church of the Contradiction is about you enter a communion where you encounter for briefly, just for a moment, just for an hour, liturgically, the otherness of the other. I want to show a video actually in a minute, just an example of what this looks like. And then one final thing I want to say then, because I come back, sorry, to the discourses I just mentioned, is there's university discourse churches, which are churches where they give you advice about who to vote for and what to do with your life, and God's got all this great advice. God is the kind of the self-help guru. There's lots of that. But what I'm interested in, again, I don't think this exists yet, is what does it mean to have a church of the analyst discourse and ultimately a church of the hysterics discourse? And I'll just mention the hysterics discourse. That's the one I'm most interested in. We also do a thing called, and I'm very interested in this, decentering practices. And decentering practices are the opposite of centering practices. They decenter you. That's like the analyst discourse. We'll talk about that some other time. The transformance art, which is what I call Church of the Contradiction, transformance art, is where you experience the hysterical God, right? It's where, if you look at the four discourses, that you're addressed by a divided subject. So in the Church of the Contradiction, you go into the church, you believe that this church is going to give you an undivided absolute, right? And we work with that. That's the subject supposed to know. You enter the Church of the Contradiction without even knowing it. You might not believe in God, doesn't matter, but you kind of believe in wholeness and completeness and oneness, and the liturgy represents it. Now, in the same way in analysis, if you think your analyst is just a person like you, the analysis doesn't really start. The analysis starts when you start to treat your analyst as a symbolic other, standing for your mother, your father, your siblings. And then ultimately when the analyst is a stand-in for the real, right? Which is why, in a sense, they sit behind you sometimes and you look up at the sky, because they are a gaze without a look. They are a presence without any sight, right? So they, in a sense, start to embody an absolute nothingness, a nothingness that is something, right? And then you start dreaming about your analyst and all that, right? So in the Church of the Contradiction, if the liturgy, if you just look at it as, oh, it's just people like me, it's not going to work. But if symbolically you start to do transference, and this becomes a type of embodiment of what the undivided reality is, the answer, the God who lacks the lack, that's the liturgy. You experience that, you project that onto it, but the liturgy does not give you that back, right? So you resist the temptation to give the analysand what they want, as Lacan said. What does the analysand want? Get my symptom working, get things fixed, get things back to normal, right? The analyst resists the demand to fix me, right? So in the same way, the liturgy rejects the demand of the congregation to give a God who fixes everything. Instead, the liturgy embraces doubt, ambiguity, and complexity within its own structure. So what it gives you back is an hysterical God, right? There is a cosmic hysteria. There is a cosmic anxiety, and that cosmic hysteria is found in the liturgy. And so when you go there and you go, my life isn't working out, I'm struggling, I've got these doubts and these unknowings, the comfort, the salvation is in seeing that those doubts and that unknowing is also in the heart of the absolute itself. That's what frees you. You do that once, it doesn't do anything, but you do this once a week or once a month over a prolonged period of time, it is introjected and it transforms your mode of being, your way of being in the world. And okay, yeah, stop it.
So we've got like about 20 minutes.
Yeah.
So, I mean, do we want to field some questions for a minute, and then we can show you the video at the end or whatever?
Perfect.
If anybody's got any questions about any or all of that.
Brilliant.
Yeah, you go. Oh.
Morning. Just hold it out like about.
Like here? Okay. Yeah, I have two questions, and I hope they fit their interest for everybody. If they're not, feel free not to. You both mentioned Genesis, and as you talked about it as a sort of Oedipal myth, an illustration of the primal fighter, and you talk about desire in Genesis. And I had a question about the fall. Is there a place for the fall in radical theology? By this, I mean, can we have a fall without it presupposing a wholeness before the fall that you can recuperate in a in a later life or whatever? Or does a fall entails, because I think that if you don't have a fall, then you're complete. But if you do have a fall, then you were complete before. So how can we get out of this conundrum? And then the other question I have is, I wonder if, because there's this debate in the Lacanians between Zizek and Lorenzo Chiesa, and I think that the last book of Zizek is in large part an answer
Response. Yeah.
And so basically, I wonder if the three-part structure that you propose between theism, atheism, and radical theology could be translated in the term of this debate. So theism would say the one is, atheism would say there is no one, and radical theology we say the not one is. But then Lorenzo Chiesa would say, well, to say the not one is, it's still a whole. That would be his. He argues for a radical indivisibility. It's still a whole. It still creates a whole. Because like a completeness of sort, that would be his provocation of sort. And so he argues for a radical indecidability. Is that an English word?
Oh, undecidability.
Yeah. So yeah, and I don't have a position in this debate, but I'm grasping for tools to understand well.
Yes.
So this will be the two questions.
Cheers. Thank you. Yeah, no, I'm just reading Zizek's book at the moment, so it's just kind of a response to that. I mean, like first of all, yeah, I mean, I would draw it. Does this work on this? Is this the right thing? I don't want to do a permanent marker. Yeah. Oh yeah, and I don't need to turn that off or anything. So you have like the original blessing, fall, and return. So this is kind of the basic religious structure. You know, you have an original oneness, wholeness, you have a fall into some sort of kind of the division, and then there's a desire for redemption, right? And then Zizek argues that actually the fall comes first. So this is loss. So there's a loss here, and then there's a return. Lack is the fall comes first. It generates the fantasy that there was an original blessing, and then this hope for a redemption. But it's this that comes first. So that's obviously the Zizekian argument. That's my argument. So fall is, and what Zizek calls, you know, following Hegel, absolute recoil, right? This is that weirdly, this is a kind of reverse causation. That it's the same as a prohibition. Before the prohibition to eat the tree, there was no desire to eat the tree. So the prohibition comes first. The prohibition generates a desire. And this is the interesting thing about in psychoanalysis. Why prohibit the mother when the mother is already impossible, right? Why prohibit incest when incest is impossible in its true terms? Like you can't stay at one with the mother, right? So why prohibit it? But that's the whole point of psychoanalysis, is actually you have to prohibit what's impossible. And if you don't, that's psychosis. Psychosis, and is that like the neurotic has to realize the big other doesn't exist. The psychotic hasn't even got that far. So the prohibition comes first, it generates a desire. The only thing is you're talking about two people here. We're practitioners, right? I love theory, but those guys are very good theorists, right? The only thing I keep coming back to is that something like Gödel's incompleteness theorem, for me, is a way of saying that there is a total system of nature. There's a total system of nature, and there is within that an exception. That's something that is true but not provable. And saying that doesn't integrate I mean, if you want to call this the unity of unity and difference, you know, you're going to go like, you know, where fascism isn't total enough, because fascism isn't able to include its exception. So I don't know if Chorizo, I can't say his name right, I hope that's the right pronunciation, is just saying that we need a system that is able to include its exclusion. But the Zizekian point for me is there's a great debate in 1948, between C.S. Lewis and Elizabeth Anscombe. Very famous debate. One of these, you know, there's a few famous debates throughout history. And it was interesting because C.S. Lewis wrote a chapter in his book Miracles called The Logical Inconsistency of Naturalism. And he argued, and you'll know the argument, it's still used by some theists, that if you're a naturalist, and he talks about total system, if you believe that nature is a total system of cause and effect, of non-rational cause and effect, then your belief in naturalism is just a response to this natural chain of cause and effect. Therefore, you cannot have any justification in believing in naturalism, right? So the idea is naturalism undermines itself, right? So that was C.S. Lewis's argument. Elizabeth Anscombe, who was even more religious than C.S. Lewis, right? One of the most famous Wittgensteinian philosophers, absolutely brilliant, mad woman. She argued that rationality can grow out of the natural system. And she basically argued that it's just a different form of cause and effect. Rationality is logical cause and effect. So there's lots of cause and effect, and then it gets to a certain level where rationality comes in, and rationality is, so it's an exception that's not outside the total system, it's an exception that's within the total system. So that's what I mean by God. And that's what I think Zizek's talking about. So in other words, I do think that you can't talk about something that is true but not provable. You can talk about something that insists. But tell me, do you think that where do you fit these two people in that discussion?
No, I think for what
Yeah.
it's worth, I think you're taking a position on Zizek.
Yes.
It's also very convincing to me. It's just I also feel I don't have the tool to understand what I'm saying. It's just too mathematical, it's too logical, and I'm too down.
Yeah.
I'm looking for
Yes.
to grasp the other position.
Yeah.
I stand with you as far as it is now. It makes complete sense to me.
It makes sense to me. Yes.
Maybe not. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I don't really need to add to those things. I mean, I do think on an entirely different level. I mean, the Jewish interpretation of Genesis doesn't believe that there was a fall, you know, so what's her name?
Oh, I know he.
Aviva Zornberg.
Oh, no, I didn't.
Do you know Aviva Zornberg? She's a Torah scholar, and now I wouldn't necessarily agree, but she says Adam and Eve didn't fall. They were birthed from a bubble to become human. So now you could argue, well, then she's talking about a wholeness before that. But for her, Adam and Eve aren't human until after the fall.
Yeah, I think so, because until Drive, like basically it's almost the story of Drive.
Her argument is that Adam doesn't get named until Eve. And so there is no man without woman. So there's a different trajectory. So to speak of the fall is a very Protestant, well, a very Christian interpretation of Genesis that links to a larger story. But I kind of like Zizek. Okay, so it gets so complicated.
Yeah.
And
already built in before we can even name it as fall.
Yes.
It's already there.
Yes.
And
Yes.
It's a question of like trying to situate it in narratives that makes it's more, I guess, romantic. Say there's a wholeness and then there's a fall, but isn't the wholeness already, is what you're talking about, already shattered?
Yes. I mean, this is the speculative dimension. It's like, why is there something rather than nothing? And the speculative kind of answer is that nothing. Well, Zizek says it in his latest book brilliantly. You know, something is a failure of nothing. There's the failure of nothingness results in something. So in a weird sense, nothingness, there is a nothing within nothing. But it's all very speculative. Sorry.
well, just really quickly, the one thing I will say about, because I do resonate with your concern or you know, trying to work out Chiesa's position and stuff like that. And I do think that when it comes, it's just my personal take. Sometimes I come across something that I read, and for whatever reason it interests me, but I may not be able to get my head around it, or I can't make sense of it, and it seems to put a tension within the horizon of some things that I'm comfortable with or that I've grown to accept. And what I usually do with that is I just accept the fact that life is full of complex contradictions, and I've just experienced a personal one, and I just have to kind of leave it there and let it hang. And surprisingly, because I often feel I'm always amazed when Pete so easily just pulls this stuff up, because I just don't think that way. And I'm like, yeah, I know that I like that theory, but I can't voice it like that. Do you know what I mean? Because I'm too stupid.
Yeah.
But what I realize is that actually somewhere you're living with this idea, even though you're not perhaps even consciously thinking about it, you may have even rejected it. And who knows what happens to that? Sometimes it returns like a nightmare, sometimes like a dream, sometimes like a gift. You know what I mean? So, and when it comes to this speculative stuff, I mean, for God's sake, it just goes on forever.
Yeah.
And eventually you have to go, I'm just going to camp here for a while. Or at least that's my take. I always figure there's more to know, there's stuff to learn, but for right now, this is the best I've got.
Couple more.
That was self-help.
We've got a few questions at the very last time. Will we hear all the questions in a row, or one at a time?
Yeah,
Whatever.
why don't we do a quick, like 2-sentence questions if you can? Then they can wrap it up.
Oh, thank you.
So, all right. So my question is, how does okay, so think in the afternoon, theology in the morning. How does the clinical structures, how does that relate to pyrotheology and your kind of your practice?
Good question. Next question. Thanks, Sawyer.
I was just wondering, because I've been trying to do the same thing as you guys in musicology, which is like the idea of taking musicology from itself in a way. But what I've been, me and Bjorn Schmelzer, with another guy who is involved in this, we have been doing it by sticking to the practices of traditional musicology, just subverting them, but still sticking to them. My question would be, how would this practically, in the practice, how would it work?
Thank you. And then Davide, 2 sentences.
Yes. I'm talking about the fall, how the dichotomy between evil and good, no? Like how evil gets into the discourse of the fall.
Yeah, brilliant.
Okay, great. Any other quick? Yes.
So in Alenka Jupanchi's book, What is Sex? The overall outline of the logic like matches what you said, like epistemology to ontology, by ontologizing the lack. So is there a similarity within the theological and the sexual?
And we have a question
Theology and
that
sexuality.
Victoria is going to read for us.
Okay, from the Zoomers. If the liturgy of radical theology recognizes a fundamental divide and lack in the cosmic absolute, how does the performative representation of such a negation for lack mediate itself authentically, considering that such a performative representation is already a positing or a positive?
Yeah.
Okay,
Right.
wow. So we have the structures,
Yeah.
musicality, good and evil, ontology, and the liturgy.
I can do these quite quickly.
Well,
You
you
wanna-
do them,
Yeah.
and if I feel like saying anything, I will.
Okay, all right, brilliant. Well, okay, I'm just going to go really quickly. So in terms of the structures, I think they're really useful in analyzing, kind of how religions exist. Like, I think there are psychotic types of religious structures, neurotic types of religious structures, perverse types of religious structures. In a nutshell, most fundamentalist churches are actually not psychotic structures. They're neurotic structures. You believe, but you don't really believe. You believe, God will sort out everything, but you lock the church at night and you believe that, I had almost like I had a psychotic belief when I had my conversion at 17. So when I had to get up really early for a flight, I would turn off my alarm clock because God would wake me up. I literally believed it. And I became a threat to the church because everybody really believed it, but I really, really believed it, right? And the point was, you're not supposed to, the people who really believe are a problem. And I encounter this a lot with if you go to Nashville, a lot of the worship groups or just hired musicians who come in and sing all the worship songs, but they're literally just hired to come in and sing the songs, and that's how they make their living. But everyone pretends that it's not the case. I've got a story about it. I won't share it, but anyway. So the structures are very useful for analyzing a lot of these kind of things. And yeah, so that's how I use those structures. Are very, very useful. In terms of the traditional musicology, we're actually going to show like an example of a piece of music that I think kind of captures what we're trying to do. So I'll bracket that question a little bit. But the tradition has all sorts of tools. No, you're saying you use, yeah, like what I did with a thing called Icon is we borrowed so many religious traditions because there's so much of this idea about darkness and doubt and unknowing, tenebrae services, all of this. There's so many resources in traditional theology that can be useful. But
The signifiers.
yes, the signifiers, exactly. And we do play with those a bit. So we've done tenebrae services where there is no, resurrection point, But evil and good, I would just say very quickly, I think of evil almost as not privation anymore, but as the covering over of privation. What causes human evil, not just badness and all the death and evolution. What causes evil is precisely kind of scapegoat mechanism that is involved with trying to cover over lack with loss. So I want to kind of fundamentally say that the human type of evil that this liturgy can help us overcome is the evil that comes precisely from thinking that lack is contingent, that some group of people are responsible for it, and if we get rid of them, everything will be good.
It's built into what you're talking.
Yeah.
Actually,
yes.
certain non-violent practices.
It's basically a critique of scapegoating. It's the critique of the scapegoat mechanism. And you take someone like René Girard, who I think is given one of the best Christologies of contemporary world, where basically the whole thing about the crucifixion is we project onto this innocent figure our own lack, and then we realize that lack is our own, and we have to take it back into ourselves. So I think there's something profound about that. And then you were talking about sexuation, gender. Yes, there's lots of connections there. I like Sapanch's work. What is Sex is an incredible book. Gender for me is, as you know, is the kind of experience of this contradiction at the level of subjectivity. I do think that you could talk about masculine and feminine sexuation in relation to these ideas of an exception that is outside the total system, which is traditional theology, and an exception within the system, which is kind of what we're kind of doing. So that's just a very short answer. I'm just blasting through these. I'm not saying very interesting things. And
the liturgy and radical theology recognizes a fundamental divide. And
yes,
the cosmic absolute.
That's good. Yeah, that's a brilliant question. And it is a continual danger. We'll always feel. It's almost like whenever you notice a slip of the tongue is already gone, right? In Todd McGowan's recent podcast in White Theory, they talk about this, that in a sense, yeah, as soon as you kind of grasp this, and maybe that's what Chorizo is doing or whatever, as soon as you kind of name this and grasp it, you've kind of lost the contradiction. What we did very practically is we had a group that met every week, and we had a great artist called Johnny McEwen. Have to look him up, he's brilliant. But he would kind of say, like, always, how do we offend ourselves? How do we critique ourselves? There was a constant kind of like enjoyment of that question, and an enjoyment of how do we create a liturgy this month that does something that provokes and challenges. And it's almost like it always feels, but by building into the very structure of the creation of the liturgy, the question of kind of like, what are we missing, and inviting others in. So we did a thing called the Evangelism Project, where we were to be evangelized by other people. So we would go to other religious communities, and the evangelism wasn't so much that we would learn from them, but we would say, what do we look like to you? And as we saw ourselves through the eyes of the other, we would see some dimension of ourselves that we might not otherwise see. Or the Last Supper, which is a decentering practice where 12 of us gather, we invite someone controversial to eat with us. And if we don't like what they say, it's their Last Supper. So it's called the Last Supper, right? So we kind of judge. So it's kind of play off a movie from the 90s with Cameron Diaz. Anyway, but the point of the Last Supper is that the guest is almost like Christ, the seat of Christ, the Last Supper. You're the bringer of truth. We don't agree with you, but through this conversation over dinner, you will help us potentially see something within ourselves that that we haven't seen. We are decentered. So, and by having a different guest every month at the Last Supper, you're trying to have a structure that weirdly continues to be able to decenter you. But you're absolutely right, that in itself will lose its power eventually. And then we have to rethink, how do we do another form of the Last Supper that has its power? But maybe I can show after Barry wants to say something close. I'd like just one example of, we created a Church of Contradiction videos recently. They're not finished, but I just got a little clip 2 days ago from one of the songs that was sung in it. It's not color graded or anything, but it might give an example of what like a song looks like within this kind of thing.
Perfect, I am broken, I'm adored, I'm unspoken, I am lonely, I'm contented, I am sin, I'm half demented, I am belief, I am science, I am peace, I am defiance, I am the cause, I am effect, I am sober, I am wrecked, I'm a whisper, I'm a choir, I'm a loser, I am on fire, I'm an extra, I'm director, I'm a pin drop, I am Phil Spector, I am nothing, I am forever, I am right now, I am never, I am brilliant, and I am dumb, I am deep blue, I am a ZX81. Black and white, I am color, I am risk, I am mother, I am holy, I am disaster, I am fucked, and I am an answer. When all these fragments start to roar, playing like an orchestra, sometimes it's hard to hear yourself think. It's like the words are crawling back inside the ink. The ink.